Snow fell relentlessly over the Apennine Mountains in the winter of 1944, falling not in the gentle, almost whimsical manner of Christmas cards or idyllic countryside scenes, but with the relentless weight of an executioner's hand, thick, heavy, and merciless, blanketing the world in a choking layer of white. It covered everything: the footprints of men and animals, the faint trails of supply wagons, the scattered debris of battle, even the fragile walls of small villages, erasing them as though they had never existed. The air was cold enough to sting lungs with every inhalation, the wind cutting across the mountains like sharpened knives, and the very snow itself seemed to carry a kind of oppressive judgment, weighing on every step, every thought, and every breath of those who dared to traverse it. Within this merciless landscape, a story unfolded that was almost never to reach the world outside those icebound peaks, a story of human endurance, courage, and the brutal indifference of war. It began with what should have been a routine reconnaissance patrol. 17 men from the 88th Infantry Division, led by the quiet but steadfast Sergeant William Keaton, a man known among his peers not for flamboyant bravery, but for calm decisiveness and unshakable resolve under fire. Their orders were simple in theory: to scout and verify a gap reported in the German defensive lines near Mount Belvedere, a gap that, if real, could allow the Allies to exploit a weak point and continue their push northward. The mission was expected to last 3 hours, a brief excursion into the bitter mountains, and yet, as fate would dictate, these 17 men would vanish into the blizzard, swallowed almost immediately by the unforgiving winter, leaving nothing behind but whispers of their existence, signs that would terrify anyone who understood the terrain, and a void in the Allied outpost that grew heavier hour by hour. At first, no one was unduly alarmed. Communications frequently failed in these mountains. Radios froze, batteries drained within hours, and patrols often returned late if they returned at all. Soldiers joked nervously about the delays, about the ghosts of Belvedere, but humor could not mask the growing anxiety as night fell and then a second night passed without word. The patrol was simply gone, leaving a silence that was thick enough to choke the lungs, a void heavy with unspoken dread. What no one yet knew, what the officers and men at headquarters could not fathom, was that Keaton and his soldiers were already fighting for their lives in a hostile world, their senses assaulted by the storm, their movements restricted, their eyes barely able to distinguish one whiteout contour from the next. The ambush struck suddenly and with merciless precision, German machine gun fire slicing through the snow, striking down men instantly. Those who survived crawled desperately into a shallow ridge, a thin line of survival pressed against the mountain's edge, freezing, bleeding, exhausted, and low on ammunition. They stumbled through drifts deeper than their knees, finding at last an abandoned shepherd's cabin, half buried under the snow, a shelter that became at once a sanctuary and a prison. Outside, German patrols moved stealthily across the ridges, day and night, like wolves circling their prey, forcing the men to retreat inside themselves, as well as the cabin walls. They rationed what little food remained, melted snow for water, huddled together for warmth, and whispered prayers that no one would ever hear, that perhaps God might notice them and grant them mercy. And when the radio finally crackled with life, a faint signal, a ghostly voice calling to them through static and ice, their hearts leapt, only to be crushed again by the message, "No support available. Hold position." The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than the blizzard outside, and in that silence every man understood the meaning. They were abandoned, yet still alive, still clinging to life by sheer willpower alone. The mountains themselves seemed to taunt them, every gust of wind a reminder of their fragility, every creaking ridge a warning of the abyss that waited just beyond a misstep. Sergeant Keaton, ever composed, never shouted, never panicked. He simply looked at his men and held their gaze, silently communicating that giving in was not an option, that hope, however slim, had to survive. He became both anchor and lighthouse, tethering their minds to sanity, to courage, and to the faintest possibility of rescue. They would not yet surrender to the mountain, to the enemy, or to the snow. While the patrol struggled against both nature and enemy fire, far away at Allied headquarters, Captain Harold Briggs felt a gnawing dread that refused to be silenced. Briggs was not merely an officer reviewing reports. He had trained, eaten, and survived countless harrowing missions alongside Sergeant Keaton. Their bond went beyond camaraderie. It was a bond forged in the smoke and mud of previous engagements, a silent understanding of each other's capabilities and endurance. The moment he learned the patrol had gone missing, a chill gripped him deeper than the winter ever could. His instinct screamed that these men were alive, somewhere in the vast frozen expanse, waiting for someone to take action, waiting for hope. Yet command was unmoved. Reports classified the patrol as presumed lost and cautioned against sending reinforcements. The German lines were too tightly held, the mountains too treacherous, and the blizzard too merciless. Every factor argued for inaction, every voice advised patience, but Briggs could not, would not accept this verdict. He moved through the tents with purpose, calling quietly to men who he knew would follow, men who understood the gravity of defying orders but trusted the urgency of his judgment. By midnight, 6 volunteers were ready to follow him into the storm. Young, determined, knowing that if they failed, they would vanish silently like the patrol they sought. The mountains offered no mercy. Traversing narrow ridges, icy slopes, and treacherous ravines, they risked plunging hundreds of meters into darkness with each step. Every crunch of snow underfoot sounded like a rifle shot in the deafening quiet. Every gust of wind a threat to stability and life itself. By dawn, the first tangible signs of the missing patrol emerged. A discarded helmet, half buried in frost. Dark sheets of frozen blood etched into the snow like warnings. And the most terrifying revelation of all, the perfect circle of German footprints patrolling the same area. Evidence that the enemy knew the men were trapped and waited patiently for their surrender or death. Inside the shepherd's cabin, the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Frostbite claimed digits with agonizing slowness, wounds festering in freezing temperatures, and hunger gnawed at the edges of consciousness. Water came from melted snow, bitter and icy, and food was rationed to the tiniest crumbs. The storm outside screamed with a voice that seemed almost human, rattling the cabin as if demanding surrender, but Keaton refused. He recounted memories of home, stories imbued with warmth and light, tales of golden wheat fields and serene ponds, attempting to tether his men to life beyond the snow, to remind them of humanity and purpose beyond survival. But the Germans were relentless. On the third night, a flare tore the sky above the cabin into brilliance, illuminating the white landscape, and within moments, mortars struck the nearby terrain, shaking the wooden walls, cracking the roof, sending clouds of smoke and splintered wood into the air. The men huddled, coughing, some quietly weeping for the first time in months, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. Keaton placed a hand on the shoulder of the trembling soldier and whispered that somehow, against all odds, they would survive. Hope, fragile but persistent, endured, even in the face of almost certain annihilation. Outside, the storm raged, the German patrols circled, and the mountains watched silently, impartial and eternal. At that same critical moment, Briggs and his rescue team observed the cabin from a ridge less than 2 kilometers away. From their vantage point, the scene below was simultaneously terrifying and filled with possibility. German troops moved like predators, their boots crunching against ice and snow, their rifles trained, ready to punish the faintest movement. Briggs assessed the terrain with meticulous attention, calculating risk, opportunity, and the limits of human endurance. Descending directly toward the cabin would be suicide. Every silhouette would be visible against the snow, a beacon to the enemy. But in the midst of this bleak landscape, he discovered a narrow cliff path wrapping around the mountain's rear. Treacherous and invisible to most, a slender chance to approach undetected. Despite its danger, Briggs rallied his team and ordered them forward. Ropes were tied around waists, boots sank into icy footholds, and hands slipped on frozen rock, but inch by inch they advanced, clinging to the mountain like frost-bitten insects. Wind howled around them, threatening to tear them from the ledge, and at times a man slipped over the edge, suspended by the ropes, while his comrade's strength pulled him back from death. By dusk, they reached a hidden ledge overlooking the cabin, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. German patrols moved below in systematic sweeps, yet life flickered faintly inside. Time seemed suspended as the rescue party waited in darkness, snow accumulating on helmets and shoulders until they resembled frozen statues embedded in the mountainside.
Inside, Keaton's men pressed their ears to the walls, listening to the wind, wondering if they were to die unseen. Then, barely audible, came a tapping. Soft, deliberate, Morse code, repeating, "Stand by." Friends. Relief surged, tempered with caution. Someone had reached them. Briggs inched closer, crawling through snow, adrenaline masking cold and fatigue, until Keaton opened the door. Their eyes met, disbelief, relief, exhaustion, fear. But there was no time for emotion. The Germans were closing in. The dialogue was brief, austere. Keaton warned that most of his men could barely walk. Briggs replied with a single, unwavering line. "Then we carry whoever we have to." And so began the perilous extraction, the culmination of determination, trust, and calculated desperation.
The escape unfolded in complete darkness, the rescuers lifting the wounded onto their backs, guiding the others along the cliff's icy, treacherous path, every step a battle against gravity, fatigue, and freezing wind. Each breath burned lungs already weakened by the storm. Each movement demanded concentration and courage, and the abyss yawned beneath them, ready to claim any misstep. Twice they nearly slipped, hanging suspended over the void, hearts hammering, muscles screaming, only to pull each other back with every ounce of strength and resolve. Once, a German patrol passed just meters below, rifles ready, forcing the group to freeze in place, suspended in tense silence, snow settling silently on their shoulders, boots, and rifles. Hours stretched like days, but inch by inch, step by painstaking step, they advanced, driven solely by the imperative to survive and save the men who had no hope of rescue without them. At first light, the ridge finally gave way to safer terrain. They were exhausted, frozen, barely conscious, but alive. Behind them, German forces discovered the empty cabin and unleashed a barrage of gunfire into the snow, but it was futile. When the group finally reached Allied lines, the rescuers collapsed in relief, while Keaton's men were rushed to field hospitals. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and, in one case, half a foot, but not a single life was lost. Officially, Briggs and his team were reprimanded for defying orders, yet privately they were commended. Their heroic story never reached newspapers or official reports, overshadowed by larger battles. But among those who lived it, the memory burned like a torch through the cold years, a testament to unyielding courage, brotherhood, and the will to defy impossible odds. 17 men had been pulled from the edge of history by 7 others who refused to let their story end, proving that heroism is often quiet, unseen, and existing far beyond the headlines. In the forgotten winter of 1944, high in the lethal Italian mountains, the endurance, sacrifice, and indomitable spirit of these men etched a legacy too rare and precious to ever let the snow bury forever. Their courage was not measured in medals or accolades, but in each freezing breath, every careful step over the cliff, every heartbeat of hope that refused to succumb to the relentless winter or the merciless enemy. History may have overlooked them, but their story, epic, harrowing, and profoundly human, remains as eternal as the mountains themselves.